She owned the film negatives to every episode of I Love Lucy. Every single one. Not the network, not the sponsors, not the executives at CBS who had looked across a conference table and decided the deal was trivially in their favor. Lucille Ball and her then-husband owned the physical negatives, and with them, everything that would ever come from those negatives for the rest of television history. CBS thought they were giving away nothing. They were wrong. In 1951, a negotiation took place in Hollywood that neither side fully understood at the time. By the time anyone understood it, it was too late to undo. The woman who walked away from that table was not just the most recognizable comedic actress on American television. She was, without knowing it yet, one of the shrewdest businesswomen the entertainment industry had ever produced. And she had earned every dollar of it with decades of struggle before a single camera ever rolled on a studio soundstage. What happened to that fortune after she died in 1989 is not a simple story. It is not the story you expect. 1/3 went to her daughter, 1/3 went to her son, and 1/3 went to a second husband. A man who would later leave everything he had inherited to a woman that her children never anticipated would become a custodian of their mother's most personal legacy. Items that had belonged to Lucille Ball. Objects she had held. Things she had kept. They moved outside the family in a transfer so quiet that it drew almost no attention when it happened. And yet it changed what the Ball Arnaz family could ever recover. Now, 75 years after the night I Love Lucy first aired, in October of 2026, her daughter Lucie Arnaz is still here, still talking, still protecting what can be protected. And the story she has told, piece by piece, across decades of interviews and documentaries and honest moments in front of cameras, adds up to something most people who loved her mother never heard in full. What did Lucille Ball actually leave behind? Who got it? And what did the family lose that they cannot get back? The answers are not hidden. They were never hidden. They were simply waiting for someone to ask the questions in the right order. April 26, 1989, Beverly Hills, California. Lucille Ball had gone into surgery 2 days before. On April 24, 1989, she was admitted to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles after complaining of severe chest pain. The diagnosis was an acute aortic aneurysm, a rupture in the body's largest artery, the vessel that carries blood directly from the heart. Surgeons operated. By every measure available, the operation was considered a success. She was 77 years old, and she had come through it. The staff at Cedars-Sinai had reason to believe she was stabilizing. 2 days later, on the morning of April 26th, Lucille Ball died. The aneurysm had extended. There was nothing more that could be done. The woman who had made an entire nation laugh for 4 decades, who had turned a husband's accented English and a wife's relentless scheming into the defining comic dynamic of American television, was gone before the morning was over. Beverly Hills, a hospital room, quietly, with the kind of finality that does not announce itself. She was 77 years old. The television networks interrupted their regular programming to break the news. Flags were lowered. Tributes arrived from every corner of the entertainment world. President George Herbert Walker Bush released a statement. The woman who had been Lucy Ricardo, who had been so completely identified with that character that for millions of Americans the two had become inseparable, was no longer alive to insist on the distinction. But behind the grief, behind the flood of tributes and the archive footage and the replayed clips of pratfalls and suitcases full of cheese, something else was already beginning. Something quieter. Something that would take years to fully understand. Lucille Ball had left an estate, and an estate unlike a legacy, must be divided. Lucille Desiree Ball was born on the 6th of August, 1911 in Jamestown, New York, a small industrial city in the southwestern corner of the state, closer to Erie, Pennsylvania than to New York City, closer to anonymity than to anything resembling the life she would eventually build. Her father, Henry Durrell Ball, was a telephone lineman. He was 28 years old when Lucille was born. He would not live to see her turn 4. Henry Ball died in February of 1915 from typhoid fever. He was 31 years old. Lucille was 3. Her brother Fred was less than a year old. In a single season, the family that had been 4 people became 3. And then, in the way that economic necessity reshapes a grieving household without asking permission, it became something harder to define. Her mother, Dee Dee, left without income and with 2 small children, went to work. She had to. There was no alternative. And so Lucille and Fred were sent to live with their maternal grandparents, Fred and Flora Hunt, in Celeron, a small town just outside Jamestown on the edge of Lake Chautauqua. What followed was not a cruel childhood in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more formative. A childhood defined by absence more than by violence, by the steady weight of not having the things that other children seem to have without thinking about it. Her grandfather, Fred Hunt, was the emotional center of her early life. He was a committed socialist, a man who believed in collective responsibility and human dignity with a fervor that his granddaughter would later credit as the origin of her own fierce loyalty to the people who worked for and with her. He took her to theater performances. He encouraged her to perform. He saw something in the girl that the world had not yet agreed to look at. Her mother eventually remarried. Lucille's stepfather, Ed Peterson, brought the family back together for a time. But Peterson and Lucille did not find common ground easily, and the household that formed around him was not the warmth she had known with her grandfather. She was, by her own later account, a child who learned early that the security she wanted was not going to be handed to her. If she wanted it, she would have to build it herself. She was 14 years old when she enrolled in the John Murray Anderson School for the Dramatic Arts in New York City. She had convinced her mother to let her go. The school was expensive, and New York was far, and the girl from Jamestown who had spent her earliest years being raised by grandparents while her mother worked was now standing in a city that did not know her name and did not care to learn it. The school's other students included a young Bette Davis. By most accounts, the instructors at Anderson paid Davis considerable attention and paid Lucille Ball almost none. She was told, in the direct and devastating language that drama schools of that era were not shy about deploying, that she did not have what it took, that she should go home. She did not go home. She found work as a model instead. She changed her hair, first blonde, then what would become her signature deep auburn red, a color so associated with her that it eventually became its own cultural shorthand for a particular kind of comedic energy. She worked under the name Diane Belmont for a time, a stage name that kept a small but useful distance between the girl from Jamestown and the persona she was carefully assembling. She got work in film, small parts, background work, uncredited appearances in productions that barely noticed her arrival and did not note her departure. She appeared in Roman Scandals in 1933. She appeared in dozens of B pictures throughout the 1930s. She was a Goldwyn girl. She was a contract player at RKO. She was, for the better part of a decade, exactly the kind of actress that the industry uses and then forgets. Talented enough to keep working, not yet positioned to break through. She was not discovered. She persisted. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and Lucille Ball understood it better than almost anyone who came up alongside her. Discovery implies luck, a single transformative moment, the right person in the right room at the right time. Persistence implies something else entirely. It implies choosing, over and over again, to stay in the room even when the room does not want you there. By the time she was 30, she had appeared in more than 40 films. By the time she was 35, she was still not a star. By the time she was 40, she had a radio program, My Favorite Husband on CBS, and a husband who believed she was funnier than anyone in Hollywood had yet figured out how to use properly. That husband was Desiderio Alberto Arnaz Ideacha III. The world would come to know him as Lucie Arnaz, and the thing they were about to build together would change the business of television in ways that neither CBS nor anyone else would fully calculate until it was far too late to renegotiate. The offer from CBS was straightforward. They wanted Lucille Ball. Her radio program, My Favorite Husband, had been running since 1948 and had built a loyal audience across the country. The format was domestic comedy. A husband, a wife, the small escalating disasters of ordinary life, rendered absurd through timing and character. CBS believed it could translate directly to television. They were right about that. What they did not anticipate, what none of them anticipated, was the specific shape the negotiation would take, or what that shape would ultimately cost them. The network's initial proposal was standard for the era. The program would be produced live in New York City, as virtually all television was produced at the time. The technology was there. The infrastructure was there. The audience was increasingly there. Television sets were moving into American homes at a rate that was still astonishing the industry every time someone stopped to look at the numbers. By 1950, nearly 10 million homes in the United States had a television. By 1952, that number would be closer to 20 million. The medium was not the future. It was already the present. Lucille Ball said no. The reason she gave was practical and personal in equal measure. She was in Hollywood. Her life was in Hollywood. She and Desi had a home there, a marriage that was already complicated by the separations that his touring schedule as a band leader had imposed on them for years, and a determination, her determination specifically, to stop the distance that had been pulling them apart. She was also, at the time, attempting to become pregnant. A live production in New York meant leaving California. It meant living separately again. After everything the marriage had already survived, she was not willing to accept that condition. But there was a second reason, one that spoke not to her personal life, but to her professional instincts. Lucille Ball did not believe that live television did justice to comedy. Live performance was, by its nature, imprecise. The camera caught what it caught. The timing that a skilled comedic actress spent years developing, the micro-adjustments of expression, the precise physical beats, the relationship between what the face was doing and what the body was doing in the same half-second, all of that was subject to the limitations of a single continuous take. Broadcast in real time, impossible to refine. She had spent 20 years in film. She knew what a camera could do when you gave it the right material in the right conditions. She wanted those conditions for her television program. Lucie Arnaz made the counter-proposal. They would film the program in Hollywood, not on videotape, which existed, but produced an image quality that was, in 1950, technically inferior to what audiences were beginning to expect, but on 35mm film, high-quality film. The kind of film used in motion picture production. They would shoot before a live studio audience, preserving the energy and spontaneity of performance, but capture it on a medium that could be edited, refined, and reproduced indefinitely at full quality. The additional cost of filming on 35mm rather than producing live was significant. CBS did not want to absorb it. The negotiation arrived at a solution that, at the time, appeared entirely reasonable to everyone in the room. The Arnazes and their production company, Desilu Productions, which they had incorporated in 1950, would absorb the additional filming costs themselves. They would accept a reduction in their per-episode salary to offset the network's financial exposure. In exchange, CBS would relinquish ownership of the physical film negatives. Every episode of I Love Lucie would be produced on film that legally and permanently belonged to Desilu Productions. CBS agreed. The reasoning inside the network's executive offices was, by later accounts, almost casual in its confidence. Who was going to want to watch old television episodes again? The medium was live by nature. Its value was in the moment of broadcast, in the simultaneous experience of millions of people watching the same thing at the same time. Once an episode had aired, it had served its purpose. The negatives were a technical byproduct, not a strategic asset. Giving them to the Arnazes cost CBS nothing, because the negatives were worth nothing. That calculation was wrong in a way that would redefine the economics of American television. The practice of rebroadcasting previously aired television episodes, what the industry came to call the rerun, had existed in a limited form almost since the medium began. But it was not until I Love Lucie that a television program demonstrated, at scale, what rerun rights were actually worth. The show premiered on October 15, 1951, and within its first season, it was the most watched program in America. By the middle of its second season, it was reaching more than 60% of all television households in the United States, a penetration figure that remains almost incomprehensible by the standards of any era of television that followed. When the show went into syndication, when local stations across the country began broadcasting episodes in rotation, filling afternoon and evening schedules with Lucie and Ricky and Fred and Ethel, the financial returns on those negatives became real in a way that CBS had not permitted itself to imagine. Desilu owned every frame, every broadcast license, every syndication deal, every international sale. Every time a local affiliate in Indianapolis or Phoenix or Baton Rouge paid to run an episode of I Love Lucie in the afternoon, the money traced back to the negatives. And the negatives belonged to Lucille Ball and Lucie Arnaz. The show ran for 6 seasons and 180 episodes from 1951 to 1957. It never finished below first place in the Nielsen ratings during any of its 6 seasons. It won 5 Emmy Awards. It was the first television program to be watched by more than 10 million households simultaneously. And every episode of it, every minute of footage, every outtake, every alternate take stored in the archive, was property of Desilu Productions. What had the CBS executives given away in that negotiating room in 1950? They would spend the next several decades calculating the answer, and the answer, each time they calculated it, was larger than the time before. How does a network give away the most valuable library in the history of television without understanding what it was handing over? The answer is simpler than it seems. They did not know what television was going to become. Nobody did. Not fully. Not yet. But one woman and her husband had negotiated as though they did. And that instinct, more than any single performance, more than any Emmy or Nielsen rating or cultural milestone, is what made Lucille Ball extra. The divorce was finalized on May 4, 1960. After 19 years of marriage, 19 years that had produced 2 children, one of the most successful production companies in the history of American television, and a comedic partnership so precise and so publicly beloved that the distance between the private couple and the public characters had become almost impossible for audiences to perceive. Lucille Ball and Lucie Arnaz ended their marriage in a courthouse in Santa Monica. California. The legal proceedings were brief. The emotional weight of them was not. What followed the divorce was a transaction that changed the ownership structure of Desilu Productions, and, in doing so, quietly altered the trajectory of Lucille Ball's financial future in ways that would not be fully visible until years later. Lucie Arnaz held 50% of Desilu. Lucille Ball held the other 50%. In the settlement that accompanied the divorce, she bought his share. The price, by most accounts, was approximately $2.5 million, a figure that sounds modest against the scale of what Desilu had become. But that reflected the valuation methodology of the era and the specific terms Desi and Lucille negotiated between themselves. He took the money, she took the company. And with that transaction, Lucille Ball became the sole owner and chief executive of Desilu Productions, making her, in 1960, the first woman to head a major Hollywood studio. That fact is sometimes noted as a historical footnote, a milestone checked off in the catalog of firsts that punctuate the narrative of women in American entertainment. But to reduce it to a footnote is to misunderstand what it actually meant in the context of 1960 Hollywood. The studio system was a male hierarchy at every level: the financiers, the executives, the producers, the directors. Women acted. Women occasionally wrote. Women did not run studios. The machinery of the business was not designed with their participation in that role in mind, and the culture that surrounded it was not shy about making that known. When Lucille Ball walked into executive meetings as the head of Desilu, she was not walking into a room that had been prepared for her arrival. She ran the company for 7 years. During those 7 years, Desilu Productions did not rest on the commercial foundation of I Love Lucie. It expanded. The studio that Lucille Ball now controlled became the production home for some of the most consequential programs in American television history. The Untouchables, the crime drama starring Robert Stack as Elliot Ness, was a Desilu production, controversial, violent by the standards of its era, and enormously successful. Mission Impossible was a Desilu production, the espionage series that would eventually spawn one of the most durable film franchises in Hollywood history. And then there was the program that, perhaps more than any other, tested Lucille Ball's judgment and her willingness to trust her own instincts over the conventional wisdom of the industry around her. Star Trek arrived at Desilu as a concept from Gene Roddenberry in 1964. The network response to the original pilot was largely negative. The premise was considered too cerebral, too expensive, too uncertain in its commercial appeal. NBC passed on the first pilot, an almost unprecedented rejection, but requested a second. The cost of producing 2 pilots before a single episode had aired was, by the standards of television production at the time, substantial. Desilu absorbed it. By most accounts, the decision was Lucille Ball's. She greenlit Star Trek. By 1967, Desilu Productions had grown into a studio operating on a scale that Lucille Ball was increasingly finding difficult to sustain alone. The costs of running a full production facility, the sound stages, the technical staff, the overhead of multiple simultaneous productions were considerable. The television landscape was changing in ways that favored larger entities with deeper capital reserves. And Lucille Ball was, for all her executive acumen, running the company without a partner for the first time since she and Desi had built it together. The offer came from Gulf and Western Industries, the conglomerate that already controlled Paramount Pictures. The price was approximately $17 million. She accepted. In the context of 1967, $17 million for Desilu Productions was a defensible valuation. Adjusted for inflation to 2026, it represents something in the range of $150 million. A substantial sum by any measure, and one that reflected the genuine market value of the studio's physical assets, its active productions, and its operational infrastructure. Lucille Ball was not swindled. She was not naive. She was a businesswoman making a calculation that her financial advisors and the market conditions of the moment supported. But the sale carried a consequence that no single line item in the transaction could fully capture. When Desilu was sold to Gulf and Western, the future broadcast rights to the programs it had produced transferred with the company. The Untouchables. Mission impossible. The programs that were still in active production. The ongoing revenue streams that those properties would generate in syndication and in licensing over the decades that followed. Those streams now flowed to Paramount, not to Lucille Ball. I Love Lucie occupied a more complicated position. The ownership of the original film negatives had never transferred out of the Ball Arnaz structure. The deal with CBS in 1951 had ensured that. But the ongoing commercial exploitation of those negatives, the syndication licensing, and the international distribution that generated income year after year, operated within a legal and corporate framework that the Desilu sale had altered. The details of exactly what Lucille Ball retained and what she relinquished in 1967 have been the subject of considerable analysis over the decades since. Analysis that her daughter Lucie Arnaz has addressed, carefully and with evident precision, in interviews given across a span of more than 30 years. What is clear is this: the woman who had walked out of a negotiating room in 1950, owning every frame of I Love Lucie, walked out of a different negotiating room in 1967 in a fundamentally different position. Not a ruinous one. Not a position that left her without resources or without income, but a position that had traded future upside, the kind of compounding decades-long royalty income that intellectual property of that magnitude generates, for an immediate liquidity event that was large by the standards of its moment and modest by the standards of what came after. She was 55 years old. She had been working since she was 14. She had built something from nothing. From a dead father and a childhood in Kelleron and 40 B pictures and a network that had told her, repeatedly and without subtlety, that her instincts were wrong. She had proved every one of them wrong, and now she had sold the company she built and taken the money, and was, by any conventional measure, secure. What would the future revenue from those properties have been worth? That is the question that sits underneath every conversation about what happened to Lucille Ball's fortune. Not because the answer is simple, but because the answer, whatever it is the foundation on which everything that followed was built. What does a woman leave behind when she has sold the company but kept the legacy? And who gets to decide what the legacy is worth when she is no longer alive to defend it? 6 months after the divorce from Lucie Arnaz was finalized, Lucille Ball was married again. The date was November 19, 1961. The man was Gary Morton, born Morton Goldapper in the Bronx, New York, in 1926, a stand-up comedian who had worked the Catskill resort circuit and the mid-tier club venues that formed the backbone of American comedy performance in the post-war decades. He was 35 years old. She was 50. The gap in age, in public profile, and in professional stature was not lost on anyone who covered the entertainment world at the time. The commentary was, by the standards of the era, predictable in its skepticism. The marriage lasted 27 years, until the morning of April 26, 1989. Gary Morton was present through the final decade of Lucille Ball's career, through her return to series television with Here's Lucie, which ran from 1968 to 1974, through her film work and her stage appearances, and the gradual transition from active performer to living legend that the entertainment industry enacts around its icons, whether they want it or not. He served as a producer on several of her projects. He was, by the accounts of those who knew them, genuinely devoted to her. A man who had built his identity largely around the life they shared, and who found in that shared life a purpose that his earlier career had not provided. When Lucille Ball died in April of 1989, her estate was valued at between $40 and $60 million. That figure requires context to be understood properly. It was not the valuation of someone who had retained full ownership of the most watched television program in American history until the moment of her death. It was the valuation of someone who had, over a career spanning 6 decades, accumulated wealth through equity ownership, through the shares she had held in Desilu, through the Lucille Ball Productions company she had operated after the Desilu sale, through real estate holdings and personal investments, and the residual income streams that her various business interests had generated. She was not poor. She was not even close to poor. But the fortune was not the fortune it might have been if the 1967 sale had never happened, or if the 1951 negotiation had been structured differently at the back end. $40 to $60 million. In purchasing power terms adjusted to 2026, that range represents something between $100 million and $125 million. It was a significant estate by any measure, and it was divided according to the terms of a legal instrument called the Lucille Ball Morton Trust. The structure was, on its surface, straightforward. 1/3 of the estate went to her daughter, Lucie Arnaz, the elder child, born July 17, 1951, the year I Love Lucie premiered. 1/3 went to her son, Lucie Arnaz Jr., born January 19, 1953, during the height of the show's first season, his birth announced on the program itself, in an episode that aired the same night his mother gave birth. Watched by more Americans than had ever watched a single television broadcast before. And 1/3 went to Gary Morton, the second husband, the man who had been present for the final chapter of her life, and whom she had chosen, clearly and deliberately, to include as an equal beneficiary alongside her own children. The decision to divide the estate in equal thirds was Lucille Ball's. It was not an oversight. It was not a compromise forced on her by legal circumstance. She had made it, apparently, with full awareness of what it meant. That a man who had entered her life 28 years after she had built the foundation of her fortune would inherit a share equal to those of the children who carried her blood and her name. What that third represented in concrete terms is not entirely a matter of public record. The estate included personal property, furniture, jewelry, clothing, memorabilia, the physical objects that accumulate across a life lived at the intersection of public performance and private experience. It included financial assets. It included whatever residual rights and royalty interests had survived the various transactions of the preceding decades. All of it was divided. All of it, in the 1/3 that went to Gary Morton, passed out of the direct custody of the Ball Arnaz family. Morton was 73 years old when Lucille Ball died. He had 10 years left. He lived them, by all accounts, quietly. He remained in the Los Angeles area. He did not seek the public profile that his connection to Lucille Ball's legacy might have afforded him. He was not, in those final years, a figure who inserted himself into the ongoing conversation about her work or her place in television history. He was a widower who had outlived the most famous woman he had ever known, and who was living on what she had left him. Gary Morton died in 1999, twice. He was 72 years old. When he died, the estate he had accumulated, which included the 1/3 share he had inherited from Lucille Ball, along with whatever it had grown into over the decades since her death, along with the personal property and heirlooms that she had left him specifically, did not return to the Ball Arnaz family. It did not pass to Lucie Arnaz or to Lucie Arnaz Jr. It was not reclaimed by the children of the woman whose accumulated life's work had formed the foundation of what Morton had inherited. It went to his third wife. Her name was Susie McAllister. She and Morton had married after Lucille Ball's death, a fact that places the relationship, whatever its origins, in the decade between 1989 and 1999. When Morton died, he left his entire estate to McAllister. That estate included personal objects that had belonged to Lucille Ball. Objects she had touched, things she had kept, items that carried, in the physical and tactile sense that objects carry meaning, the texture of her private life rather than her public one. Those items moved outside the Ball Arnaz family permanently. There was no legal mechanism to prevent it. Gary Morton had inherited those items outright. They were his to dispose of as he chose. The trust that Lucille Ball had constructed had been executed exactly as she had designed it. The equal thirds had been distributed, the legal formalities had been observed, the estate had been settled. What happened afterward, when Morton made his own decisions about his own estate, was beyond the reach of anything Lucille Ball had put in place. Lucie Arnaz has spoken about this. Not with bitterness, exactly, or not only with bitterness, with the particular kind of careful honesty that a person develops when they have had decades to sit with a loss and have decided that the most useful thing they can do with it is tell the truth about what happened. The personal legacy of Lucille Ball, the objects, the heirlooms, the physical traces of the woman behind the icon, had been divided in ways that her children could not have anticipated and could not reverse. What remained with the family was the other kind of legacy, the one that cannot be physically transferred or legally inherited, the one that lives in the footage and the performances and the cultural memory of a woman who had made herself impossible to forget. That legacy had a guardian, and in October of 2026, 75 years after the first episode of I Love Lucie aired on a Monday night in 1951, that guardian was still at work. But before the story of what Lucie Arnaz has protected, there is one more chapter of what was lost, and how it was lost, that the record requires. What does it mean to inherit a mother's name, and not her objects? What does it mean to be the daughter of Lucille Ball, and to know that the things she kept close, the things she chose to hold on to across a lifetime, now belong to someone else entirely? Lucie Desiree Arnaz was born on July 17, 1951, 67 days before the first episode of I Love Lucie aired on CBS. She came into the world, in other words, at the exact moment her parents were building the thing that would define them forever. She grew up inside it. She performed inside it, appearing alongside her mother in The Lucie Show, and later in Here's Lucie, the series that ran through her teenage years and into her early 20s, the programs where the boundary between the Ball family's private life and their public performance was, by design, almost non-existent. She was Lucie Arnaz on screen because she was Lucie Arnaz in life. The character and the person were the same person. That proximity to the legend, growing up as the daughter of the most recognized woman in American television, performing beside her, watching her work from a distance of a few feet on a studio soundstage, gave Lucie Arnaz something that no biographer, no documentary filmmaker, no archive researcher could replicate. It gave her the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of what it actually looked like from inside. And for decades, she has been willing to say what she saw. Not all of it was easy to say. Not all of it was easy to hear. The documentary that brought the fullest version of Lucie Arnaz's testimony to the widest audience was released in 2022. Lucie and Desi, directed by Amy Poehler for Amazon Prime Video, was not a conventional celebrity biography. It did not traffic in the managed distance of authorized hagiography or the equally managed distance of revisionist exposure. It was built, in large part, around Lucie Arnaz herself, around her willingness to sit in front of a camera and speak with a precision and an emotional directness that people who loved her parents had been waiting for years to hear. What she said about her father's death is among the most quietly devastating things the documentary contains. Lucie Arnaz died on December 2nd, 1986. He was 69 years old. Lung cancer. He had been diagnosed some time before, and the final months of his life had been spent in Del Mar, California, in a house near the ocean that he had made his home after the years of Hollywood and Desilu, and the marriage that had defined the first half of his adult life were behind him. Lucie was with him at the end. She has said, in terms that do not permit misunderstanding, that he died in her arms. She was 35 years old when her father died. What she revealed in the documentary, the detail that landed with the particular weight of something that had been true for a long time before anyone outside the family knew it, was the timing of the final conversation between her parents. Lucie Arnaz and Lucille Ball had been divorced for 26 years when he died. They had built a company together, performed together, raised children together, and then separated, in the way that two people who are genuinely incompatible in the specific ways that marriage makes incompatibility unavoidable eventually must. But they had not lost each other entirely. On the day Lucie Arnaz died, November 30th, 1986, though he was declared dead on December 2nd, Lucille Ball called him. Lucie heard her mother on the telephone. She heard what her mother said. She said, "I love you. I love you. I love you." What Lucie Arnaz revealed was the layer beneath that already remarkable fact. November 30th was their wedding anniversary. The anniversary of the day in 1940 that Lucie Arnaz and Lucille Ball had stood together and made the promises that the subsequent decades would test in almost every way that promises can be tested. He died on their anniversary. She told him she loved him on their anniversary, and neither of them, at that moment, knew the date's significance to the other. Or perhaps both of them knew exactly what they were doing. And that is a different kind of revelation entirely. Lucie Arnaz sat with that knowledge for decades before she said it on camera. She has also spoken, across multiple interviews given over the course of 30 years, about the financial architecture of what her mother left behind, and about what the equal division of the estate ultimately meant for the family in concrete, practical terms. She has been measured in how she discusses Gary Morton. She has not, by any public account, made him the villain of the story. He was her mother's husband. He was present for the final chapter of a life that Lucie Arnaz loved and grieved and has spent decades working to honor. The choice her mother made to include him as an equal beneficiary was her mother's choice, made freely and deliberately, and Lucie Arnaz has not publicly challenged the legitimacy of that choice. What she has been willing to name is the consequence. When Gary Morton died in 1999 and left his estate to Susie McAllister, items that had belonged to Lucille Ball moved permanently outside the family. Personal objects, things that carried the specific weight of a private life, rather than a public one. The kind of objects that a daughter does not think about when her mother is alive because they are simply there, present, ambient, part of the texture of a home and a relationship. And that become irreplaceable the moment they are gone. Some of those objects have appeared at auction over the years. Personal memorabilia associated with Lucille Ball, items traceable to her household and her private collection rather than to formal studio archives, has surfaced in the secondary market in ways that confirm, indirectly but unmistakably, that the flow of those objects out of the family did not stop with the initial transfer of Morton's estate. Lucie Arnaz has spoken about encountering her mother's belongings in contexts she did not control and could not have anticipated. The foundation she established, the Lucie Arnaz Foundation, has directed its resources toward projects that work to preserve and expand what can still be preserved. Educational initiatives, archive work, the kind of institutional memory building that ensures a legacy survives not just as entertainment product available for licensing, but as a genuine cultural inheritance with a custodian who cares about its accuracy and its completeness. She has also been direct about the broader pattern she sees in how Lucille Ball has been remembered, and sometimes misremembered. The image of Lucy Ricardo, the hapless housewife who schemes and stumbles and inevitably lands in trouble of her own creation, has proven so durable and so culturally adhesive that it has, in some quarters, displaced the reality of the woman who created her. The woman who negotiated the ownership of the film negatives in 1951, the woman who bought out her ex-husband's share of a major studio in 1960 and ran it alone for 7 years. The woman who greenlit Star Trek when the network had already said no. The woman who, when the industry told her she did not have what it took, found a different industry inside the same industry and built something it had never seen before. Lucie Arnaz does not accept the displacement. She has spent 30 years insisting, in interviews and in the documentary and in public appearances and in the work of her foundation, that the character and the businesswoman are not the same person, and that the businesswoman deserves to be seen clearly, without the filter of the character she created, without the softening that comes from reducing a complex and formidable life to its most beloved surface. In 2022, when Lucy and Desi was released, something shifted in the public conversation about Lucille Ball. The documentary arrived in the same year as a biographical film, Being the Ricardos, directed by Aaron Sorkin, that dramatized a single week in the production of I Love Lucy, and that brought new attention to the questions of authorship and power and creative control that had always been present in the story, but had not always been centered in the telling of it. The two works arrived within months of each other, and together generated the most sustained public conversation about Lucille Ball's actual life, as opposed to her character's life, in years. Lucie Arnaz was in the middle of all of it, responding, correcting, adding the specific detail that only she possessed, saying, as clearly as she could say it, what her mother had actually been, and what her mother had actually built, and what the family had kept, and what it had lost, and why any of it mattered in 2022, more than 30 years after the woman herself had died in a hospital room in Beverly Hills on a Tuesday morning in April. She was 70 years old when the documentary came out. She had been carrying this story for longer than most people carry anything. And in October of 2026, as the 75th anniversary of I Love Lucy approaches and the cultural machinery of commemoration begins to turn, she is still carrying it, still correcting the record, still protecting the legacy, still saying, to anyone who will listen, that the woman her mother was deserves to be seen more clearly than the world has yet managed to see her. In October of 2026, I Love Lucy turns 75 years old. 75 years since a Monday night in 1951, when a red-haired woman from Jamestown, New York, stood in front of a studio audience in Hollywood and made an entire country laugh at the same time. 75 years since a negotiation that gave her something CBS did not understand. It was giving away. 75 years since the foundation of something that would outlast the marriage that built it, the company that housed it, and the woman who made it possible. Lucie Arnaz is 74 years old. She is still here. She is still the person most qualified to say what her mother actually was. Not the character, not the icon reduced to a single image, but the woman who spent 20 years failing before she succeeded and then spent the rest of her life building structures that would survive her. The woman who owned the negatives, the woman who ran the studio, the woman who said, "I love you," on an anniversary neither of them knew they were marking. The fortune Lucille Ball left behind was divided into thirds, and one of those thirds traveled, through the ordinary mechanics of inheritance, to a place her children could not follow. Some of what she kept close, the private objects, the personal things, are gone from the family in ways that cannot be reversed. The business decisions of 1967 traded future income for present security, and reasonable people can weigh that trade differently depending on where they stand. But the legacy itself, the actual substance of what Lucille Ball built, and what she meant, and what she understood about power and ownership and creative control that the people around her did not, that is not gone. It is in the footage. It is in the deal memo from 1951 that changed the economics of television forever. It is in every program that Desilu produced, and every decision that Lucille Ball made as the first woman to run a major Hollywood studio. And it is in her daughter, the one who heard her mother say "I love you" into a telephone on a November afternoon, and understood, only later, what day it was. Lucie Arnaz has spent 30 years making sure the world knows who Lucille Ball actually was. Not the version that fits on a coffee mug, the real one. The one with the business instincts and the stubborn refusal and the 2 decades of failure that preceded every year of success. That is the legacy that cannot be inherited by a stranger. That is the legacy that cannot be sold at auction or transferred through a will or moved outside the family by any mechanism the law provides. 75 years on, it is still intact. And if the story of Lucille Ball has ever made you look differently at what it means to build something from nothing, to negotiate from a position of apparent weakness and walk away with everything that matters, then leave a tribute in the comments for the woman who owned every frame. And subscribe so the next story finds you. She earned it. Every frame of it. Every single one.